In the fall of 1975, a young nurse named Maria Santos vanished without a trace from Portland, Oregon. For 35 years, her brother refused to give up, searching, questioning, hoping. Then, in 2010, construction workers made a discovery that would shake the medical community to its core. What they found beneath St. Catherine Hospital wasn't just evidence of Maria's fate. It was proof of something far more sinister, a predator who had used his position of trust to hunt for decades. This is the story of what really happened to Maria, and why some secrets stay buried until someone refuses to stop digging. Before we begin this investigation, let us know where you're watching from in the comments and subscribe for more mysterious disappearance stories like this one. Portland, Oregon in 1975 was a city caught between its industrial past and uncertain future. Rain-slicked streets reflected neon signs from diners and jazz clubs. The Vietnam War had ended, but its shadows still lingered in the faces of returning veterans who walked the downtown streets. Mount Hood loomed in the distance, a constant reminder of nature's permanence amid the city's constant change. St. Catherine Hospital stood on the east side, a solid brick building that had served the community since the 1940s. Its corridors echoed with the soft footsteps of nurses and the quiet conversations of families hoping for good news. The pediatric ward on the third floor was painted in cheerful yellows and blues, with cartoon characters decorating the walls to comfort frightened children. November brought early darkness and persistent drizzle that turned the city's streets into mirrors of reflected light. The air smelled of wet leaves and distant wood smoke from chimneys. People hurried between buildings with umbrellas and turned-up collars, eager to escape the damp cold that seemed to seep into everything. But for the staff at St. Catherine Hospital, the weather was just another part of the routine. They had patients to care for, lives to save, and families to comfort. The rain might make the parking lot treacherous and the walk to their cars unpleasant, but it couldn't stop the essential work of healing that happened within those brick walls. This was the world Maria Santos knew and loved, a place where her gentle voice and skilled hands brought comfort to children when they needed it most. She had no way of knowing that someone was watching her every move, documenting her routines, and planning something unspeakable. Maria Santos had the kind of smile that could calm a crying child from across the room. At 28, she possessed a natural grace that made even the most difficult medical procedures seem less frightening to her young patients. Children would stop crying when she entered their rooms, somehow sensing the genuine compassion that radiated from her dark eyes and gentle manner. She had worked at St. Catherine Hospital for 5 years, starting as a new graduate from Portland State University's nursing program. The pediatric ward had become her calling, where she specialized in caring for children with chronic illnesses and complex medical needs. Her supervisor, head nurse Dorothy Walsh, often said Maria had an intuitive understanding of what sick children needed, not just medical care, but emotional comfort that helped them heal faster. Maria lived modestly in a small 2-bedroom apartment on Division Street with her younger brother Carlos. The apartment was neat and cheerful, filled with plants that Maria tended with the same care she gave her patients. She had decorated the walls with children's artwork, thank you drawings from former patients whose recoveries she had helped along with her dedication and skill. The Santos siblings had been on their own since their parents died in a car accident 7 years earlier. Maria had been 21, Carlos just 16, when tragedy struck their family. Instead of pursuing her own dreams of traveling or starting a family, Maria had focused on raising her brother and building a stable life for both of them. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and deep love. Carlos worked as a mechanic at Murphy's Garage downtown, a job he had taken straight out of high school to help with expenses. Maria insisted on paying most of the household costs, knowing that Carlos sent part of his earnings to their elderly grandmother in Mexico. They shared a quiet routine of family dinners on Sundays and occasional movies at the neighborhood theater. Maria's colleagues at the hospital knew her as someone who never complained about difficult assignments or long hours. She often volunteered for extra shifts during holidays so that nurses with families could spend time at home. Dr. Patricia Coleman, who supervised the pediatric unit, relied on Maria's judgment and frequently sought her input on challenging cases. Despite her devotion to work and family, Maria wasn't unhappy or lonely. She had close friendships with several other nurses and occasionally went on dates with men she met through friends or at church. She simply hadn't found someone she wanted to build a life with, and at 28, She felt no pressure to settle down just for the sake of marriage. Maria's routine was predictable and comforting. She preferred working night shifts, finding that the quieter atmosphere allowed her to give each child more individual attention. She would arrive at the hospital by 10:30 p.m., receive report from the evening nurses, and then spend the next 8 hours providing round-the-clock care to children whose conditions required constant monitoring. The hospital's night shift culture was like a small family. The same core group of nurses, doctors, and support staff worked together regularly, developing the easy camaraderie that comes from sharing the intimate responsibility of caring for people during their most vulnerable hours. Maria was well liked by everyone, known for bringing homemade cookies to share and remembering personal details about her colleagues' lives. What none of them knew was that someone else had been studying their routines with far more sinister intentions. Monday, November 15, 1975, began like hundreds of other nights at St. Catherine Hospital. Maria arrived at 10:25 p.m., 5 minutes early as always, parking her yellow Volkswagen Beetle in the employee lot behind the main building. The rain had been falling steadily all day, turning the unpaved sections of the parking area into muddy patches that nurses navigated carefully in their white shoes. The pediatric ward was busier than usual that evening. A 6-year-old boy had been admitted with severe pneumonia, and a teenage girl was recovering from emergency surgery for a ruptured appendix. Maria moved between the rooms with quiet efficiency, checking vital signs, administering medications, and providing the gentle reassurance that had become her trademark. Dr. Richard Hayes, the attending pediatrician, made his evening rounds around midnight. Hayes was 53 years old, a respected physician who had worked at St. Catherine for 7 years. He had a reputation for being thorough and competent, though some nurses found him a bit cold and formal in his interactions. Maria had worked with him on dozens of cases and appreciated his medical expertise, even if she sometimes felt uncomfortable with his tendency to stand closer than necessary when they discussed patient care. During that night's rounds, Hayes spent considerable time reviewing the pneumonia case with Maria. The boy's condition was serious but stable, requiring careful monitoring throughout the night. Hayes asked detailed questions about the child's breathing patterns and seemed unusually interested in Maria's assessment of the family's emotional state. She provided her usual thoughtful observations, not noticing the doctor's intense focus on her rather than the medical chart. The shift proceeded normally until about 2 a.m., when Maria took her customary break to have coffee in the small staff lounge. The lounge was located in the basement level, accessible by a stairway near the main elevators. It was a simple room with a few chairs, a coffee machine, and lockers where staff could store personal belongings during their shifts. As Maria sat alone with her coffee, reviewing notes for her end-of-shift report, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. This wasn't unusual. Maintenance staff often worked during night hours, and doctors were frequently called for emergencies. She paid little attention to the sounds until she noticed they seemed to stop directly outside the lounge door. When Maria finished her break and returned to the pediatric ward, everything seemed normal. The patients were sleeping peacefully, and her remaining tasks for the night were routine medication passes and documentation. She worked steadily until 6:30 a.m., when the day shift nurses began arriving to receive report and take over patient care. Maria gave her usual thorough report to the incoming nurses, detailing each patient's condition and any concerns that needed continued monitoring. She gathered her personal belongings from the locker in the basement and said goodbye to her colleagues. Several nurses later remembered that Maria seemed her normal self, tired from the long shift, but cheerful and looking forward to getting home. The hospital's security guard, Frank Morrison, was making his rounds when Maria left the building through the employee entrance. Morrison had worked at St. Catherine for 12 years and knew most of the regular staff by name. He watched Maria walk to her car, noting that she seemed to be moving more quickly than usual, perhaps eager to get out of the cold drizzle. Maria's yellow Volkswagen started on the second try, despite the damp weather. Morrison saw her pull out of the parking lot and turn onto the street that would take her toward Division Street and home. The time was exactly 6:45 a.m., according to the security logbook where Morrison recorded all employee departures. The route Maria traveled every morning was familiar and safe, at least by 1975 standards. She would drive north on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard for about a mile, then turn west onto Division Street for the final stretch to her apartment. The entire journey normally took 12 to 15 minutes, depending on early morning traffic and weather conditions. But on this particular morning, Maria Santos would never complete that familiar drive home. Somewhere between the hospital parking lot and her apartment building, she simply vanished. Carlos Santos woke up at 7:30 a.m. expecting to hear his sister moving around their small apartment, preparing for bed after her night shift at the hospital. The apartment was silent except for the steady drumming of rain against the windows. Maria's bedroom door was open, her bed still made from the previous day. Carlos checked the kitchen, thinking Maria might be having a cup of tea before sleep, as she sometimes did when she was too wound up from work to rest immediately. The kitchen was empty, with no signs that anyone had been there since Carlos had cleaned up after dinner the night before. By 8 a.m., Carlos was genuinely worried. Maria was nothing if not predictable in her routines. She always came straight home after work, always called if she was going to be delayed for any reason. Even when she occasionally stopped for groceries or ran other errands, she would phone to let him know she would be late. Carlos tried calling St. Catherine Hospital, speaking to a day shift supervisor who confirmed that Maria had completed her shift normally and left the building on schedule. The supervisor suggested that Maria might have decided to have breakfast somewhere or run errands before the stores opened. Carlos knew this was completely unlike his sister, but the supervisor seemed unconcerned. By 9 a.m., Carlos was dressed and driving Maria's usual route home, searching for any sign of her yellow Volkswagen. The rain had intensified during the early morning hours, creating poor visibility and treacherous driving conditions. Carlos drove slowly, checking every side street and parking lot along the way. He found no trace of Maria or her car. No evidence of an accident, no abandoned vehicle, no indication that she had stopped anywhere along her normal route. The absence of any clues was more frightening than finding evidence of trouble would have been. Carlos spent the rest of Monday morning calling everyone he could think of who might have seen or heard from Maria. He contacted their few relatives in the Portland area, checked with Maria's closest friends from nursing school, and even called the local hospital to see if she had been brought in as a patient. No one had seen her since she left work that morning. The Portland Police Department's response to Carlos's missing person report was frustratingly dismissive. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and coffee stains on his uniform, listened to Carlos's concerns with apparent disinterest. Young women sometimes needed space, he explained. Maybe Maria had met someone and decided to spend time away from home. Perhaps she was having personal problems she hadn't shared with her brother. Carlos insisted this was completely unlike Maria, emphasizing her sense of responsibility and her devotion to her patients and family. The sergeant suggested waiting another day before filing an official report. Most missing adults, he said, returned home within 48 hours with reasonable explanations for their absence. The suggestion that Maria had voluntarily disappeared angered Carlos deeply. Anyone who knew his sister understood that she would never cause such worry deliberately, especially not when she knew Carlos would be terrified by her absence. The police officer's casual dismissal of his concerns revealed a frustrating ignorance about Maria's character and the closeness of their relationship. Carlos left the police station feeling more alone and frightened than ever. If the authorities wouldn't take Maria's disappearance seriously, he would have to search for her himself. Time was slipping away, and every hour that passed without answers made the situation more desperate. The Hispanic community in southeast Portland quickly rallied around Carlos when news of Maria's disappearance spread. Local churches organized prayer vigils and volunteer search parties. Spanish-language radio stations broadcast descriptions of Maria and her car, asking listeners to report any information. Businesses owned by Latino families displayed missing person flyers with Maria's photograph and description. Rosa Martinez, who managed the small market where Maria shopped for groceries, coordinated many of the community search efforts. She had known Maria since the Santos siblings moved to the neighborhood, and she understood that Maria would never voluntarily cause such pain to her family. Rosa organized teams of volunteers to search parks, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings throughout the district. The searches were systematic and thorough, covering every accessible area within a 5-mile radius of Maria's last known location. Volunteers walked through Laurelhurst Park, checked along the banks of the Willamette River, and explored industrial areas where an abandoned car might go unnoticed. Despite hundreds of hours of searching by people who cared about Maria, no trace of her was found. Father Miguel Santos, no relation to Maria, at St. Mary's Catholic Church led weekly prayer services for Maria's safe return. The church became an unofficial headquarters for the search efforts, with volunteers meeting there to coordinate activities and share information. The community's response demonstrated how much Maria had meant to everyone who knew her, but it also highlighted the growing desperation as days passed without answers. Local television stations covered Maria's disappearance, featuring interviews with Carlos and hospital colleagues who described Maria's dedication to her patients. The news coverage generated tips and reported sightings from throughout the Pacific Northwest, each one requiring investigation that ultimately led nowhere. The media attention helped keep Maria's case in the public eye but also raised false hopes that were repeatedly crushed by dead ends. After a week of community pressure and media attention, the Portland Police Department officially opened a missing person investigation. Detective James Riley, a 15-year veteran with a methodical approach to casework, was assigned to lead the inquiry. Riley had handled dozens of missing person cases during his career, and his experience had taught him to be skeptical of dramatic explanations. Riley's investigation was thorough and professional. He interviewed Maria's co-workers at the hospital, questioning everyone who had worked with her during her final shift. The interviews revealed nothing unusual about Maria's behavior or mood on the night she disappeared. Colleagues described her as her normal caring self, perhaps a bit tired from the busy shift, but showing no signs of distress or unusual preoccupation. The detective also interviewed patients' families who had interacted with Maria during her final weeks at work. Parents of children in the pediatric ward spoke glowingly of her kindness and professionalism. Several mentioned that Maria had seemed particularly caring toward their children, spending extra time to ensure they were comfortable and well cared for. Dr. Richard Hayes was among those interviewed by Detective Riley. Hayes described Maria as a competent and dedicated nurse who took excellent care of his patients. He mentioned their collaboration on the pneumonia case during her final shift, praising Maria's clinical judgment and attention to detail. Hayes appeared genuinely concerned about Maria's disappearance and offered to help the investigation in any way possible. Riley expanded the investigation beyond Portland, coordinating with police departments in surrounding cities and states. Missing person bulletins were distributed throughout Oregon, Washington, and California, but generated no credible leads. The detective also checked with bus terminals, train stations, and airlines to see if Maria had left Portland voluntarily, but found no evidence of travel. The investigation revealed that Maria's bank account had not been accessed since the day before her disappearance. Her savings account contained nearly $3,000, money she had been saving to help Carlos with college expenses. If Maria had left voluntarily, Riley reasoned, she would likely have withdrawn money for travel and living expenses. Riley also examined Maria's apartment thoroughly, looking for signs of hasty departure or evidence of foul play. The apartment was neat and organized, with no indication that Maria had packed for a trip or planned to leave. Her suitcase remained in the bedroom closet, and her work uniforms were hanging ready for the next week's shifts. As weeks passed without breakthrough, Riley began to suspect that Maria's disappearance might be connected to a crime. The complete absence of evidence suggesting voluntary departure, combined with Maria's strong ties to family and work, pointed toward foul play. However, the detective found no obvious suspects or motives for anyone to harm the well-liked nurse. The investigation expanded to include background checks on hospital staff and patients' family members, looking for anyone who might have had inappropriate interest in Maria. Riley also researched similar disappearances in the region, hoping to find patterns that might suggest a serial predator. These efforts consumed months of investigative time but produced no significant leads. Riley's superiors began pressuring him to focus on newer cases with better prospects for resolution. Maria's file was gradually moved to the Cold Case Division, where it joined hundreds of other unsolved disappearances. The detective assured Carlos that the investigation would continue, but resources were limited and other cases demanded attention. Frustrated by the stalled police investigation, Carlos decided to hire a private investigator using money from Maria's savings account. Robert Chen, a former Portland police detective who specialized in missing person cases, agreed to review the evidence and conduct independent interviews. Chen was thorough and experienced, but after 6 weeks of investigation, he reached the same dead end as the official inquiry. Chen did identify some aspects of the case that deserved further investigation. He noted that Maria's route home took her through several areas that were poorly lit and relatively isolated during early morning hours. The private investigator also observed that the timing of Maria's disappearance, just after dawn when few people were on the streets, would have provided opportunities for someone to approach her without witnesses. Despite his professional expertise, Chen was unable to identify any suspects or locate physical evidence that might explain Maria's fate. He suspected foul play but couldn't prove it or point the investigation in any specific direction. The private investigation provided emotional support to Carlos but no concrete answers about Maria's disappearance. Carlos also consulted with several psychics and spiritual advisors, desperate to explore every possible avenue for finding his sister. Most offered vague, generic insights that proved unhelpful. One psychic claimed to sense that Maria was being held captive somewhere cold and dark, leading Carlos to search abandoned warehouses and storage facilities throughout Portland. These alternative approaches consumed time, money, and emotional energy that Carlos could barely afford, but he felt compelled to investigate every possibility, no matter how unlikely. The psychic consultations provided temporary hope but no useful information about Maria's actual whereabouts or fate. The ongoing mystery of Maria's disappearance began taking a severe psychological and physical toll on Carlos. He lost significant weight and developed chronic insomnia, often spending entire nights driving through Portland searching for any sign of his sister. His work performance at Murphy's garage suffered as he became increasingly distracted and unable to focus on routine tasks. Carlos's supervisor, Mike Murphy, was sympathetic to his situation and allowed flexible scheduling to accommodate Carlos's need to pursue leads in Maria's case. However, Murphy worried about Carlos's deteriorating health and suggested he might need professional counseling to cope with the trauma of his sister's disappearance. The emotional strain also affected Carlos's relationships with friends and extended family members. Some people began suggesting that he needed to accept reality and move on with his life, well-meaning advice that Carlos found impossible to follow. How could he abandon Maria when she might still need his help? How could he stop searching when she might still be alive somewhere? Carlos felt increasingly isolated as the months passed without answers. He avoided social gatherings where people might ask about Maria or suggest that he was becoming obsessed with the search. The apartment he had shared with Maria became both a comfort and a source of pain, filled with reminders of their life together but empty of her presence. The financial costs of the ongoing search efforts also created significant stress. Carlos had spent Maria's savings on private investigators and psychics, money that had been intended for his education. He took on additional work at the garage, working overtime to pay for missing person flyers, newspaper advertisements, and other search-related expenses. By the first anniversary of Maria's disappearance, Carlos had to face the possibility that he might never know what happened to his sister. The thought was devastating, but the complete absence of clues or leads made it increasingly difficult to maintain hope. Still, he couldn't bring himself to stop searching entirely or to give up the belief that someday, somehow, the truth would emerge. As the 1970s became the 1980s, Carlos settled into a different kind of routine centered around keeping Maria's memory alive while acknowledging that active searching had reached its limits. He maintained Maria's apartment exactly as she had left it, paying the rent each month and visiting weekly to water her plants and dust her belongings. The landlord, Mr. Peterson, was understanding about the unusual arrangement, having known and liked Maria. Carlos created a detailed scrapbook documenting every aspect of the search for Maria, including newspaper clippings, photographs from volunteer searches, and copies of all police reports and investigative materials. He organized annual memorial services at St. Mary's Catholic Church, where friends and former colleagues shared memories of Maria's kindness and dedication. The memorial services became important community events that kept Maria's case in public consciousness. Former patients and their families attended, sharing stories about how Maria had helped them through difficult times. Hospital colleagues described her professional excellence and personal warmth. These gatherings provided Carlos with emotional support while ensuring that Maria wouldn't be forgotten. Carlos also established a small scholarship fund for nursing students at Portland State University, ensuring that Maria's commitment to caring for others would continue helping people pursue medical careers. The scholarship requirements emphasized service to underserved communities, reflecting Maria's own dedication to caring for patients regardless of their ability to pay. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Carlos continued to research similar cases and maintain contact with missing person organizations nationwide. The development of computer databases and the Internet provided new tools for sharing information and connecting with other families facing similar tragedies. Carlos learned to use computers at the public library, spending hours searching for any information that might relate to Maria's case. Despite these technological advances, Maria's disappearance remained as mysterious as ever. No physical evidence had ever been found, no credible witnesses had come forward, and no similar cases in the region suggested a clear pattern. Carlos began to accept that he might never know exactly what had happened to his sister, but he refused to let her memory fade. The 1990s brought changes to Portland that transformed the city around Carlos. Urban renewal projects demolished old buildings and constructed new developments. The hospital district expanded significantly, with St. Catherine Hospital growing into a major medical center. Many of the landmarks from Maria's time were gone, replaced by modern structures that held no memories of the young nurse who had once walked these streets. Carlos himself had aged visibly during the search years. His dark hair had turned completely gray, and his face was marked by chronic worry and sleepless nights. He had never married, unable to commit to a relationship while Maria's fate remained unknown. Friends and family members occasionally tried to introduce him to potential partners, but Carlos felt it would be a betrayal of Maria's memory to build a new life while hers remained unresolved. In 1995, Detective James Riley retired after 30 years with the Portland Police Department. Before leaving, he met with Carlos one final time to discuss Maria's case. Riley admitted that he had never encountered a disappearance quite like Maria's, where someone had vanished so completely without leaving any trace. He promised that the case would be reviewed by the Cold Case Unit, but warned Carlos not to expect any dramatic breakthroughs after so many years. The transition to a new generation of investigators meant that Maria's case was handled by detectives who had no personal connection to the original investigation. The new officers were professional and respectful, but they viewed Maria's disappearance as an old case with little chance of resolution. Carlos felt the institutional memory of his sister's case slowly fading as the years passed. The turn of the millennium brought both hope and resignation to Carlos's continuing search. He was now in his 40s, a middle-aged man whose adult life had been defined by the mystery of his missing sister. His search had become more methodical and less desperate, focused on maintaining Maria's memory and supporting other families rather than actively pursuing new leads. Carlos had become something of a local expert on missing person cases, frequently contacted by families facing similar tragedies. He provided emotional support and practical advice based on his decades of experience navigating police bureaucracy and media attention. These activities gave purpose to his suffering while honoring Maria's memory through service to others. The early 2000s brought significant changes to St. Catherine Hospital as medical technology advanced and patient care evolved. The old brick building that Maria had known was expanded and renovated several times, with modern wings added to accommodate new equipment and larger patient volumes. The pediatric ward where Maria had worked was relocated and redesigned, eliminating most traces of the environment she had known. In 2008, hospital administrators announced a major renovation project that would modernize the facility and add new wings for cardiac care and cancer treatment. The construction would require demolishing several older sections of the building, including basement areas that had been part of the original hospital structure from the 1940s and 1950s. Carlos watched the announcement on local news with mixed emotions. He understood the need for modernization and improved patient care, but felt saddened by the loss of one of the last physical connections to Maria's life. The building where she had worked and been seen for the last time would soon be transformed beyond recognition. The demolition began in early 2009, with construction crews systematically dismantling older sections while keeping the main hospital operational. Carlos made a point of driving past the construction site regularly, watching as pieces of Maria's former workplace disappeared under bulldozers and wrecking balls. The process was both painful and somehow cathartic, as if he were finally saying goodbye to a chapter of hope that had sustained him for decades. On March 15, 2010, construction foreman Mike Chen made an unexpected discovery that would transform Maria Santos from a missing person into the victim of a crime more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Chen was overseeing the demolition of the hospital's original basement level when his crew uncovered a hidden room that didn't appear on any building plans or architectural drawings. The room was accessible only through a concealed door that had been hidden behind a false wall for decades. The space measured approximately 12 feet by 8 feet, with concrete walls and a single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. What Chen found inside would shock investigators and finally provide answers to Maria's disappearance after 35 years. The hidden room had been converted into a makeshift surveillance center and storage space. One wall was covered with photographs, hundreds of surveillance-style pictures showing hospital employees, particularly young women, taken without their knowledge over what appeared to be many years. The photographs showed subjects entering and leaving the building, eating lunch in the parking lot, and going about their daily routines unaware they were being watched. Also in the room were personal items that appeared to have belonged to different women: jewelry, identification badges, pieces of clothing, and other small objects that seemed to be keepsakes or trophies. A small desk held notebooks containing detailed observations about hospital staff schedules, routines, and personal information. The systematic nature of the materials suggested long-term surveillance and planning. Chen immediately contacted hospital security and the Portland Police Department, understanding that he had uncovered evidence of serious crimes. The room was sealed while detectives and forensics experts began the careful process of cataloging and analyzing the disturbing collection of materials. Detective Sarah Kim, who now headed the Cold Case Division, arrived at the scene within hours of the discovery. Kim was an experienced investigator with a reputation for solving difficult cases that other detectives had abandoned. She immediately recognized the potential significance of the hidden room and ordered a complete forensic analysis of all materials found inside. Among the hundreds of photographs covering the wall, Detective Kim found several images of Maria Santos. The pictures showed Maria arriving for work, taking breaks outside the hospital, and walking to her car in the employee parking lot. The photographs were dated from October and November 1975, just weeks before her disappearance. Kim realized she was looking at evidence of systematic stalking that had preceded Maria's abduction. The discovery sent shockwaves through the hospital administration and the Portland Police Department. Hospital officials were horrified to learn that someone had been using their facility as a base for stalking employees, while police administrators faced criticism for failing to solve Maria's case despite evidence that had been hidden in the building for decades. Kim immediately reopened Maria's case as an active homicide investigation, despite the decades that had passed since the disappearance. The photographs and other materials found in the hidden room provided the first concrete evidence that Maria had been the victim of foul play, transforming the case from a missing person inquiry into a murder investigation. Carlos received the call from Detective Kim on a Thursday afternoon while he was reviewing work orders at Murphy's garage. The news that evidence related to Maria's case had been discovered after 35 years left him speechless. He had maintained hope for so many years, but had never really expected to receive a call like this. Kim asked Carlos to come to the police station to discuss the discovery and potentially identify some of the items found in the hidden room. The meeting was emotional and difficult, as Carlos found himself face-to-face with physical evidence of his sister's final weeks. The photographs of Maria were disturbing, showing that someone had been watching her closely before she disappeared. The investigation into the hidden room's contents revealed patterns that extended far beyond Maria's case. Detective Kim cross-referenced the photographs with missing person reports from the 1970s and 1980s, finding matches for several other women who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances during the same time period. All of the matched cases involved young, attractive women who worked at St. Catherine Hospital or other medical facilities in the Portland area. They had vanished during night shifts or while walking to their cars after work, suggesting a predator who specifically targeted healthcare workers and was familiar with their schedules and routines. Hospital personnel records from the relevant time period revealed several employees who had worked at St. Catherine continuously during the years when the surveillance photographs were taken. The investigation focused on individuals who would have had access to all areas of the building, including basement storage areas where the hidden room was located. Dr. Richard Hayes emerged as the prime suspect in the investigation. Hayes had worked at St. Catherine from 1968 to 1982, giving him access and opportunity during the entire period when the photographs were taken. His position as a senior physician would have provided perfect cover for surveillance activities and would have made hospital employees less likely to question his presence in restricted areas. Detective Kim's investigation into Dr. Hayes revealed a troubling history that had been overlooked or covered up during his time at St. Catherine. Several former nurses, now elderly, remembered Hayes as inappropriate and unprofessional in his interactions with young female staff members. Some recalled reporting his behavior to supervisors, but no disciplinary action had ever been taken. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Kim discovered that Hayes was not only still alive, but was continuing to practice medicine as the director of a major medical center in Tacoma, Washington. At 78 years old, he had built a distinguished career over decades, rising to positions of significant authority and respect within the medical community. The revelation that the suspected predator was not only alive but still in a position of power sent shockwaves through both the Portland Police Department and the broader medical community. Kim faced immediate pressure from various institutions concerned about potential liability issues and negative publicity that might result from accusations against such a prominent physician. Hospital administrators worried about lawsuits and damage to their reputation. City officials expressed concern about Portland's image and the potential impact on the medical industry. Hayes's colleagues in Tacoma found it difficult to believe that someone they respected could be capable of such crimes. Despite the institutional pressure, Kim continued her investigation with Carlos's unwavering support. She coordinated with Washington state authorities to conduct surveillance on Hayes while building a case based on the evidence found in the hidden room and testimony from former hospital employees who remembered his inappropriate behavior. The investigation revealed that Hayes owned several properties throughout the Pacific Northwest and had maintained connections to medical facilities in multiple states throughout his career. More disturbing was Kim's discovery that several women had disappeared near hospitals where Hayes had worked or consulted over the years, suggesting a pattern of predatory behavior that had continued for decades. In November 2010, 35 years after Maria's disappearance, Washington State Police arrested Dr. Richard Hayes at his home in Tacoma. The arrest was initially kept quiet while investigators searched his properties for additional evidence. What they found confirmed Kim's worst fears about the scope of Hayes's crimes. Hayes had maintained detailed records of his surveillance activities and victims over decades. Hidden in his basement were additional photographs, personal items taken from victims, and journals documenting his methods for selecting and stalking targets. The evidence suggested that Hayes had operated as a serial predator throughout his medical career, using his position and reputation to avoid suspicion. Carlos received news of Hayes's arrest with overwhelming emotions. After 35 years of searching, he finally had answers about who was responsible for Maria's disappearance, but the knowledge brought pain as well as closure. The evidence suggested that Maria had been killed shortly after her abduction, meaning that decades of hoping she might still be alive had been in vain. The legal proceedings against Hayes were complicated by the age of the crimes and challenges of prosecuting cases from decades earlier. Many potential witnesses had died, physical evidence was limited, and statute of limitations issues prevented prosecution for some crimes. However, the evidence found in the hidden room and Hayes's personal collection provided compelling proof of his guilt. Hayes maintained his innocence initially, claiming that someone else must have used the hidden room without his knowledge. His expensive legal team argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that their client was being scapegoated for unsolved crimes. However, forensic analysis definitively linked Hayes to the surveillance materials, and additional evidence from his properties supported the prosecution's case. In March 2011, facing overwhelming evidence and multiple murder charges, Dr. Richard Hayes entered a guilty plea in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. The plea agreement required Hayes to provide information about the location of his victims' remains and to cooperate with investigations into other unsolved cases that might be connected to his crimes. Carlos was present in the courtroom when Hayes entered his guilty plea, finally facing the man who had destroyed his family and stolen his sister's life. The moment was both satisfying and heartbreaking, providing the answers he had sought for 35 years while confirming his worst fears about Maria's fate. Hayes showed no emotion during the proceedings, appearing more concerned about the legal consequences than the pain he had caused his victims' families. His clinical detachment was disturbing to everyone present, reinforcing the image of a predator who viewed his victims as objects rather than human beings with families who loved them. The information provided by Hayes led authorities to several burial sites on properties he had owned over the years. Maria's remains were found in a remote area outside Portland, finally allowing Carlos to lay his sister to rest with dignity. The funeral, held 36 years after her disappearance, was attended by hundreds of people who had known Maria or been touched by Carlos's search for answers. Hayes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, effectively ending his career as one of the Pacific Northwest's most prolific serial killers. The case revealed how institutional protection of respected professionals had allowed a dangerous predator to operate with impunity for decades, victimizing young women who trusted him because of his medical credentials and authority. During his plea negotiations, Dr. Richard Hayes finally revealed the truth about Maria's disappearance. His confession, delivered without emotion, exposed the calculated nature of his actions. Hayes had been obsessing over Maria for months, documenting her routines from his hidden basement room. He had developed an unhealthy fixation on her kindness toward patients, which had evolved into a dangerous delusion that she was meant to be with him. On the evening of November 14, 1975, Hayes had punctured one of Maria's car tires while it was parked in the employee lot. He used a small medical instrument to create a slow leak that wouldn't be immediately noticeable but would cause the tire to go flat during her drive home. As planned, Maria's tire began losing air as she drove along her usual route on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. When she pulled over to the side of the road in the early morning darkness, Hayes appeared, claiming he had seen her car trouble and stopped to help. Maria, recognizing Hayes as a respected doctor from the hospital, felt safe accepting his assistance. Hayes offered her a ride to a nearby service station, suggesting they could call for roadside assistance from there. Trusting his professional reputation and apparent concern for her safety, Maria got into his car. Instead of driving to help, Hayes took Maria to a remote property he owned outside Portland. When Maria realized what was happening and demanded to be taken home, Hayes became enraged that she was rejecting what he believed was his expression of love. The confrontation escalated tragically. Maria attempted to escape, but Hayes prevented her from leaving. She died that night, and Hayes buried her remains on his property. Maria's car was later moved to an isolated location where Hayes dismantled it completely, ensuring no trace would ever be found. The confession finally gave Carlos the complete truth he had sought for 35 years. His sister had died because she showed kindness to a colleague who twisted that compassion into a deadly obsession. Though the answers brought pain, Carlos found some measure of peace knowing Maria's memory would live on through the scholarship fund and the many lives she had touched during her time as a nurse.